Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Health Animated. On this podcast, we strive to make health information accessible to you. My name is Alex.
And I'm Danielle. To our returning listeners, thanks for your ongoing support. And for those of you who are new, welcome. We hope you stick around. So today, we have a very exciting topic in store. We want to talk about the COVID-19 vaccine. So right now in Canada, there's only 2 vaccines that have been approved. They're both mRNA vaccines, and one is the Pfizer-BioNTech, and the other is the Moderna vaccine. Fun fact about the Pfizer-BioNTech, you can either pronounce it BioNTech or BioNTech. Apparently, the CEO says both are acceptable. He just wants people to call it whatever they feel comfortable with. So we feel comfortable with BioNTech.
I think it'll be kind of good to share with you guys our process as we were navigating through this episode. So one of the challenges we had with this episode was the information was constantly changing and evolving with COVID-19. So this is what we know so far regarding the vaccine at the time of this recording. Just to let people know, we are recording this on the day of January 21st. And as a disclaimer, we want to remind people that the information that we're presenting today is for the purposes of information. At the end of the day, it's really important for you to speak to your healthcare provider to determine whether or not it will be appropriate for you to receive these vaccines. So with that being said, let's jump right in. One thing that I was pleasantly surprised about was just how quickly our world came together to create this vaccine. We've never been able to create a vaccine so quickly.
There's still a lot of work that was poured into this vaccine. And it's kind of important to know because I think one of the things that people bring up is that they feel hesitant to receive the vaccine because it was done so quickly. So DNA vaccines have been researched for about 25 years, and RNA vaccines have had about 10 to 15 years of strong research. So I think from a timing perspective, we benefited from the hard work and research that people put in. And actually, a lot of that was due in part to the SARS virus and the MERS virus that occurred earlier in the 2000s. So I think we were able to build a very strong foundation. And that being said as well, a lot of money was poured into making these vaccines possible. So a lot of the companies that were researching these vaccines received large grants from philanthropists, which allowed them to kind of get to market in a way that they wouldn't previously be able to do without assuming a large amount of risk. So the fact that the whole world banded together and poured money and research and time into this really allowed these vaccines to come to life. So it wasn't that they just, in the blink of an eye were developed in the course of a year, although on paper it does kind of appear that way. It was actually a lot of groundwork and a lot of foundational research that went into these vaccines.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's something to be said about the decades of research that have been put into studying this technology. And when money is not an issue, anything is possible. And it's really reassuring to know that we've come so far as a society, as a scientific community, to be able to take something that was just on the bench all the way to a product that's available to the public with so much speed. Based on that, I think we can all now feel a little bit more at ease, knowing that moving forward, we do have the capacity to do something really great when everybody just works together.
Yeah, hats off to those scientists that created this vaccine. So in terms of the vaccines, what is currently approved in Canada right now, Alex?
So that's a very good question. And I'm going to preface it by saying that this answer is being framed in the context of Canada because that's where we're from. So we recognize that there are other vaccines that are available, and depending on where you're from, the types of vaccines that are being approved could look slightly different. But going back to Canada, we currently have 2 vaccines that are authorized. So the first one is called Pfizer-BioNTech, and the other vaccine is called Moderna. And what's interesting is, similar to the United States, in Canada, they've been granted what's called an interim order with terms and conditions. The regulatory bodies that make decisions on approving drugs to be available on the market basically granted permission for this vaccine to be released to the public because it's in the best interest to society and to the public. However, with that being said, there are certain rules that these companies have to follow in order to maintain its status. This might be extra information for people, but as an example, I looked into the terms and conditions for Pfizer. So what they promise to do is they promise to provide a 6-month safety update to Health Canada. They're also going to provide a 2-year report on their current clinical phase 2-3 trial. Which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. They will also ensure to submit safety reports regularly and to treat any sort of side effects as a priority and report them to Health Canada as soon as possible. So basically, from what you can tell from this information is that the safety of our public is a priority. And then with the Moderna vaccine, it's very similar to what I described with the Pfizer vaccine. The other thing I wanted to kind of touch upon is there are also 2 other vaccines that are currently being reviewed in Canada. So they're not quite approved yet, but we can expect that they will be. So the first one is AstraZeneca. You may have actually heard this in the news because it was actually approved in the UK and Mexico. And then the other vaccine is the Jansen Vaccine, which for everyone's interest is actually owned by the company Johnson & Johnson, which I'm sure you're familiar with. They make a lot of baby products. So what's interesting about this Janssen vaccine is it's the very first single dose vaccine that's being studied. And there is interim data that's anticipated to be available at the end of this month. I think this is really exciting news, and I think we should all just stay tuned for this information to be released. So circling back to the mRNA vaccines, how does this vaccine work?
So I'm going to take you guys back to the days of high school science where we're going to use some terminology that you probably haven't heard in a while. So the COVID-19 vaccine, it utilizes mRNA technology. So essentially what the vaccine contains is it contains mRNA that's enclosed inside of a lipid nanoparticle. So this lipid nanoparticle is what allows the mRNA to get to the delivery location, which is your body's cells, intact, because mRNA is really fragile itself, so it wouldn't be able to make it without the help of this lipid nanoparticle. So once it gets inside of the cell, the mRNA then provides instructions to the cell's protein production factory. That's called a ribosome for those that want to go back with me to grade 12 science. So what this ribosome does is it reads the mRNA strand and it creates a protein out of it. And what protein is it creating? I think a lot of you probably already know this. It's creating the COVID-19 spike protein. So this spike protein is then expressed on the cell that just created it. So the cell is essentially then taking the spike protein and then it's putting it on its outer layer, kind of like, you can think of it like a party hat. So it's just wearing the spike protein. So the moment that your body's immune system sees that it's wearing the spike protein, it will go and attack that cell. So then it will create an immune response. So your body now has essentially a mugshot of what that COVID spike protein looks like. So when it sees the COVID virus circulating in your body, it will then be able to find it and attack it right away so it doesn't cause viral illness.
Dang, Danielle, that was a smooth explanation. So one thing that I thought was really interesting is how they arrived at deciding on what protein to use. So the reason why they picked the mRNA that codes for this spike protein is because when they studied the coronavirus, they found that it actually used the spike protein as a way to anchor and enter our human cells to cause an infection. So by actually targeting this specific protein, it then prevents the coronavirus from being able to infect our own body. Okay, so now that we understand the theory behind how these mRNA vaccines work, what's also important is how it actually works in humans. And the way that they study that is through conducting these clinical trials. We'll walk you through the major trials that were done.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's start with Pfizer. So I want to share with you guys the Pfizer-BioNTech study design. So I think it's really important because you want to know, where is this data coming from? So it's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And in this trial, they enrolled over 43,000 patients to either receive the vaccine or the placebo. So of those participants and investigators, none of them knew what they were getting. So they didn't know if they were getting the vaccine or if they were getting placebo. So anytime we look at a study, we always want to know, okay, who was included and who was excluded? Because when you're analyzing the data, you want to see, is this data generalizable? So in the Pfizer study, they actually included individuals ages 12 and up. However, it should be noted that people between the ages of 12 and 15 made up a very small number of the participants. So only 88 participants. So that's 0.2% of the population studied. So that's something to keep in mind, right? Especially when we're looking at this data and looking at the recommendations that come out from this data. So they excluded people that were immunocompromised, that were pregnant or breastfeeding, that had unstable medical conditions, or people that had previously had COVID-19. And that makes sense because those people would already have antibodies circulating. So if they were included, then they could falsely inflate the effectiveness of the vaccine. So in terms of the population that they looked at, it's no surprise that about half were men and half were women because it was a randomized trial. And in terms of the demographics, about 83% of them were white. And in terms of age, they actually went out and they set parameters on how many people they wanted to have in the trial that were above the age of 55, which I thought was pretty good. So they actually set out to include more than 40% of their participants to be above the age of 55. And they did achieve this target. So they had over 42% that were above the age of 55. And why is that important? It's important because people that are older are the ones that are getting sicker from COVID-19. So that was important to look at. However, 55 is still pretty young. So if we look at the proportion greater than 65, it was actually about 22%. So that's kind of the population in a nutshell. One other thing I'd like to point out is that it actually was a multi-center study that occurred globally. So they had sites within the US, within Argentina, Brazil, Germany. Those were the biggest sites. So with the effectiveness data, before we jump into it further, I just want to point out that although there were 43,000 people that were enrolled in this study, only just over 37,000 were actually analyzed in the safety and efficacy data. And why that is because the FDA and Health Canada, the regulatory bodies, they required the manufacturers to have at least 2 months of safety and efficacy data before they could apply for the emergency use authorization. So that is why we had 43,000 people that were enrolled, but the study only looks at 37,000. So of these 37,000 people, within the placebo arm, 162 went on to develop COVID-19 that was symptomatic. However, within the vaccine arm, only 8 participants went on to develop symptomatic COVID-19. So that puts the efficacy of this vaccine at about 95%, which is pretty staggering when you think about it.
If you think about like the flu vaccine that we update every single year, I think the evidence for that kind of hovers around like 59% or so. It depends on the strain that's circulating and the strains that are being put into the flu vaccine. But it just amazes me how you can have such high efficacy with this type of vaccine.
And it should be noted, in this study, there were no major safety concerns, but we will go into some of the side effects a little bit later.
Yeah, so that's great. So I will be representing Team Moderna. Not that I endorse it more than Pfizer, but just to give you a really quick snapshot of this clinical trial. The setup was very similar to the Pfizer vaccine. So, I'm not going to go over all the details again, but essentially they enrolled about 30,000 people. You had to be at least 18 years old to enroll in this study. And what they did was they gave the standard dosing regimen. So 2 doses, 28 days apart. Unlike the Pfizer trial, this was all conducted in the United States, which accounted for, I think, a total of 99 sites. In terms of like the specific demographics, they did intentionally exclude those that were pregnant and also children. So we'll come back to this point later on in our episode, but just keep that in mind. On the flip side, they did include those that had chronic medical conditions. So conditions such as diabetes, lung disease, HIV, although in the grand scheme of things, they did represent a smaller proportion of the overall participants. And like Danielle said, it's really important to look at the breakdown of how many participants were actually over the age of 65, because those tend to be at higher risk of experiencing severe COVID-19 symptoms. So if you look at the data, it was about 25% of the participants were over 65. So I'm sure you guys want to know what the results were. So again, this data is based on about 2 months worth of data because they had to apply for emergency use authorization. But just looking at that time frame, they noted 11 cases of COVID-19 in those that received the vaccine. And in the placebo, 185 people got COVID. If you do the number crunching, you'll end up with an efficacy rate of 94.1%, which is very, very similar to Pfizer.
So now that we know a little bit about who was studied and how effective the vaccine is, how safe is it? Because I think that's the question that's really on everyone's minds.
So for the mRNA-based vaccines, after when you get it, you can expect what's called local and systemic types of side effects. In the clinical study, what they noted as local side effects included pain, swelling, redness at the injection site, and what's called localized axillary lymphadenopathy, which is essentially swelling of your lymph nodes that are just under your armpits. The other category of expected side effects are called the systemic side effects. So what's been noted in the clinical studies included fever, fatigue, headache, chills, myalgia, which is the technical term for muscle aches, arthralgia, technical term for having joint pain. So now that I've explained some possible local and systemic side effects, what's the likelihood of you actually getting these side effects? Well, studies have shown that about 80 to 89% of those that are vaccinated will receive at least one local side effect, and about 55 to 83% will develop at least one systemic side effect following vaccination. Most of these side effects will just be mild to moderate in severity, and they would usually occur within the first 3 days of vaccination, and they should resolve within 1 to 3 days of onset. Now, what's really interesting is that these symptoms are actually more frequent and severe following the second dose, and among those who are younger compared to those who are older.
89% experiencing local side effects kind of surprises me, because I would think it'd be 100%, because I don't know anybody that experiences a vaccine without being like, ow, that hurt. I always have to make sure I keep moving my arm after it.
Are you just weak, Danielle?
No.
I'm kidding. Very random, but speaking of getting vaccines, I've actually received some vaccines where I did not feel it at all. It's really bizarre.
It must have to do with who's administering it, maybe. Maybe you just got a really good nurse.
So just to complete the picture, going back to the clinical trials, the researchers did note that some people did experience what's called hypersensitivity-related adverse events. So what they mean by that is some people may have experienced a rash after getting this vaccination. What's reassuring is that the percentages were actually quite low in terms of who actually experienced these adverse events. So it actually hovered around 1 to 1.5%. And again, it just depends on the vaccine. So what's also reassuring is that anaphylaxis was not observed in the Pfizer or Moderna COVID-19 vaccines clinical trials. So just to quickly explain, anaphylaxis is a really serious reaction to a vaccine or a medication or a food product where you have symptoms such as shortness of breath, swelling, which may block your breathing, and it's an emergency situation. So with that being said, there are some limitations with these studies. So there are some really rare side effects. For example, those that might be 1 in 10,000 or even rarer than that would actually need really large numbers of participants for it to be even detected. And then the second limitation is with the Moderna and Pfizer studies, they only had about 2 months worth of data.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, Alex, that we only have really 2 months of that clinical trial data. However, the study is still going on for 2 years, and they will provide, as Alex mentioned, that interim report at 6 months, and they're reporting all of the adverse reactions to Health Canada. So Health Canada actually has an active surveillance database that's looking at this data. So right now, it's as up to date as of January 8th, 2021. So as you remember, we're at January 21st right now. So you might see more data on this portal when this podcast is released. To date, as of January 9th, we've administered 338,423 vaccines in Canada. And of those vaccines that were administered, there were 24 adverse reactions that were reported. Of those 24 reactions that were reported, 10 of them were deemed to be serious. So that proportion is about 1 in 3,000 of those adverse effects were reported to be serious.
I think it's really cool that the government of Canada is providing this information publicly to people to check out because, yeah, you're right. Like with these clinical trials, we can only know so much, and we really need that real world data. And this doesn't really come as a surprise to me, just knowing that how the numbers are quite low compared to what's being seen in the clinical trials, because it does depend on patients reporting the side effects to the healthcare providers and then the healthcare providers reporting it to Health Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, because we all know that, muscle aches and pains and that local injection site pain is common with vaccines, many of us won't be reporting those side effects, right? So we're just seeing the ones that are something to mention to your healthcare provider. So the most frequently reported serious and non-serious events were vaccine site reactions, so the local reactions that Alex talked about earlier, paresthesias, which is like that tingling and numbness sensation, nausea, pruritus, which is itchiness, chest discomfort, and in some cases, anaphylaxis. It should also be noted that there have not been any deaths reported secondary to the vaccine. So another thing that I think is really important to note is that in Canada, we actually have a law called Vanessa's Law that requires mandatory reporting of adverse reactions that are related to therapies such as drugs or vaccines. So if you are to report an adverse event to your healthcare provider, then it's mandatory that they report that to Health Canada. And also, it's actually mandatory as well for the drug company to report any known adverse events as well. We do have kind of layers of reporting mechanisms built into our Canadian healthcare framework, which I think is kind of reassuring. As Alex mentioned, I think it's important to just reassure people that these adverse events are being examined from a safety standpoint.
Yeah, and also being transparent about the information, because there's a lot of misinformation and fear that's being spread about vaccines in general. And so having something like this that's transparent and open to the public, I think is really important, and it helps to instill trust and confidence in people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of those kind of myths or kind of worries that I've heard as well circulating is people are actually fearful of the mRNA vaccine altering their DNA. So we also just wanted to assure people that that is not even possible because mRNA can't actually get into the nucleus of the cell, which is where the DNA is housed. So it does not have that risk. So just you can rest assured of that. So Alex, this question's come up a lot. Can you transmit COVID-19 if you have received the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think you and we were digging around just to search for this answer. And I think where we're at right now is we actually don't know. In terms of how these clinical trials were designed, their main efficacy endpoint was just to determine if the vaccine can prevent you from getting sick from COVID-19. As we mentioned, there's quite a few limitations with these trials. Like right now, the data is limited. And so I think time will tell, because as they're continuing with collecting the efficacy and safety data and following up with participants, I think we'll be able to have a better idea about whether or not people who receive the vaccine can still transmit the disease. So with that being said, if you are someone who did receive the COVID-19 vaccine, it's still really important to practice all the measures that are being implemented currently. So wearing a mask, hand hygiene, practicing social distancing. So those are all still really important until we gather more information and until that information becomes available to the public. So with that being said, do you think you can still catch COVID-19 after getting the vaccine?
So what the clinical trials tell us to date is yes, because 8 of the people in the COVID-BioNTech arm did still experience symptomatic COVID-19. Of note, though, they actually looked at the severity of viral illness caused by COVID-19 in the Moderna study, and they found that all of the severe cases were actually in the arm that did not receive the vaccine, and that was in the placebo arm. We can be assured that even if you were one of the few people, so just around 5% of people that still catch COVID-19, it would likely be less severe than not receiving the vaccine.
Yeah, that actually brings up a really good point, because then we start to cross into lines of ethics, because as we mentioned, these studies are still ongoing, and if you are in the arm that's received the placebo vaccine, I think we're going to have to get to a point where there might have to be some unblinding, and we might have to share information with the participants, letting them know of the continued risks of not receiving the vaccine. Which is fine, because when we do these studies, the first thing we need to do is do no harm and to protect our participants. What that just means is when they start to analyze the data moving forward, it's probably going to be a bit more messy than we would like. However, there are still other ways to interpret the safety and efficacy data.
Yeah, Alex, I think you bring up such a good point about the ethics around that.
So one thing I was really curious about, and this is like digging into the data, is the question of, will I be protected with just one dose? Because as we know, currently with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, they do require 2 doses in order to receive optimal protection.
So Pfizer released some interim data published by the World Health Organization that talks about the efficacy data after 1 dose of the vaccine. So what they found was that at day 12, after receiving the first dose of the vaccine, the efficacy of the vaccine sat at around 89%. This level of protection lasts for 42 days or 6 weeks. However, we're not sure what the efficacy of it is beyond that duration.
And what's interesting is that the Moderna vaccine also supports a similar type of conclusion. So when we're looking at the Moderna vaccine, it can actually provide around 80% protection after the first dose. And as Danielle mentioned earlier, take this data with a grain of salt, because there isn't enough data about longer protection beyond 28 days.
I think it's interesting, Alex. So we know based on the exclusion criteria that certain populations weren't studied. So these populations include pregnant patients, very, very few pediatric patients. And of the pediatric patients studied, it was only 88 12 to 15-year-olds. So very few children. Patients that were immunocompromised were excluded. So what is the current guidance for those populations? So right now in Canada, the National Advisory Committee for Immunizations is recommending that patients that are immunosuppressed, individuals with autoimmune conditions, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, or children between the ages of 12 to 15, may be offered the vaccine if healthcare providers believe that the benefits of receiving the vaccine outweighs the risk. So really, it's if you fall into one of these groups, have a conversation with your healthcare provider to see if it's right for you. Okay, so Alex, similar to the flu shot, do you think that we're going to need a COVID-19 vaccine every year?
We actually don't know just yet. A lot of it really depends how the coronavirus evolves over time, and if it's able to pick up mutations that are significant enough to change the spike protein structure, because as we mentioned earlier, the spike protein structure is what it utilizes to enter our human cells and to cause an infection. Fingers crossed, hopefully these mutations won't be very significant and won't occur very often. So what's been a bit concerning is hearing about these variant strains that have been circulating in countries such as the UK, South Africa.
Yeah, the variant strains. So I think so far what we know about the variant strains is that the vaccine will still be effective, as they don't believe that the variant strains have mutated spike proteins. So that's reassuring. And another thing from just based on the readings that I've done is that it sounds like the coronavirus is actually quite slowly mutating compared to other viruses like influenza. So I think that is reassuring. But it is definitely something that is being monitored. So you can actually do something called genotyping, where you sequence the genetic makeup of a virus to see what is changing. And so scientists are keeping a very close eye on those variant strains to ensure that our vaccines will still be effective against them.
That's actually a really interesting point, because even if the coronavirus evolves, we have the technology now to rapidly sequence the DNA, the mRNA, in order for us to create a new vaccine. And we've proven that as a society, we have the ability to produce these vaccines at a very unprecedented rate and that we've never seen before. So, which kind of brings me to like the next question. I don't know if we really have an answer for it, but it'll be interesting to kind of hear from your perspective, Danielle. So once this pandemic is over, do you think we'll be more ready for the next pandemic if it does occur within our lifetime?
So I think if it's a coronavirus, we're ready, because those mRNA vaccines, from what I've read, it sounds like it can be a little bit of plug and play. So plug the new mRNA sequence in, but that also might be wishful thinking. And, I'm not one of the scientists that slaved away over these the creation of these vaccines. So but I do believe in the scientists and the science that we have. I do think that we will, as a society, take the necessary efforts to prepare for another pandemic. I think we're all going to be very cognizant of it, because it has been life-altering for many of us, and I think it's going to be something that we never forget. I sure hope so, and I hope we don't see another one in our lifetime, or in anyone's lifetime, because it's not fun.
Well said. I love your positivity and optimism. I also hope that we don't ever experience another pandemic, and I think one is enough for our lifetime.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, one is definitely enough.
So I think one of the things we want to leave with you guys is, hopefully from listening to this episode, if you've made it this far, is that you've gained more information about the pros and cons of this vaccine, and think about how it might apply to yourself, because at the end of the day, receiving the vaccine, or any other vaccine for that matter, is a personal choice. I'm not in line yet to get it, but I'm hoping that once it becomes more widely available to the general public, you can guarantee that I'll be one of the first people in line to get it. What about you, Danielle?
Oh, absolutely. I will definitely be in line.
So before we wrap up, the other thing to keep in mind is, by the time we release this episode, it'll be a week from today's recording. So just be mindful that things continue to change. New information continues to become available. So just make sure to check your latest public health sources for the latest information about the coronavirus and the COVID-19 vaccine. And I sincerely hope that we are at the tail end of this pandemic, now that we're now focusing our efforts on our vaccines, and that over time more and more people will be able to receive it. So fingers crossed that our future in 2021 will be bright.
Fingers crossed. That's a nice positive way to end it. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to unpack this topic today. We hope you enjoyed yourselves, and we hope that you learned something. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you stream your podcasts. And thank you all so much for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.